So this is my Rasputin Dreamweaver Commander deck, and this is actually a theme deck built around blink effects. So the goal of the deck is to run a bunch of creatures with good come into play abilities, and then bounce effects and blink effects, which let me reuse those abilities. And this deck was my honest attempt at building a casual deck for a change, because I honestly didn't think it would do that well, but it ended up being a pretty vicious deck in the end. And I think the reasons for that are any deck which is built around reusing resources is going to do very well, because you've always got a ton of options at your hand, and you're never spending new cards to have those options. You're always just reusing the ones you've already got on the board. And also any deck which consistently has access to 14 mana by turn 7, or maybe as early as turn 5, is going to do very, very well. So it ended up being a very strong deck. The reasons I like this deck, it's not just a pile of good stuff, it's basically a big web of synergy. Every card makes every other card better. There's a whole bunch of neat interactions you can pull off. Different cards work with each other in different ways, and basically every time I play the deck I'm discovering a new trick I can do with the cards I have. And another reason I like it, it was really cheap to build. I just sort of built this with extra cards I had on hand, plus a few cards I was able to pick up in trades. Didn't have to buy anything, so that made me happy. And also you get to use one of these old school legends from Legends. There's not many playable old border generals, but Rasputin is definitely one of them. So I'm going to go through this deck, and hopefully you'll get some ideas for your own Blink deck, because it's a pretty fun deck to play. So first I want to talk about Rasputin Dreamweaver. He's actually a pretty awesome general for this deck. The first thing to note is that he gives me access to white and blue, and I think any Blink deck is going to want to have those two colors at the very least. You could run this as a 3-color deck to get more options, but you'd have to run an inferior general, because Rasputin's ability is pretty awesome in a Blink deck. It's a big wall of text, but the important thing to note is that he comes into play with 7 counters, which I can remove to add mana to my mana pool. The idea is that I can blink him to reset those counters, and basically always have access to a ton of mana. I can use this mana just to make my shenanigans easier to cast, or I can use it to cast a massive spell much earlier than people would have expected. He's going to give me access to 14 mana by turn 7, which is pretty huge. He also basically gives me access to 1 extra mana the turn he comes out, since he costs 6, and he gives me access to 7. So I can use that to accelerate a Time Stretcher in Eldrazi if I'm only 1 mana short. He's actually pretty non-imposing. Most people don't know what to expect the first time they see him. They just see a wall of text and realize that all he does is generate mana, so they don't really feel threatened by him. But I think once people have played against this deck a couple of times, they realize just how dangerous he is, especially when I start reusing him. So they tend to kill him pretty fast. That's sort of a drawback, because he's awesome the first time I cast him at 6 mana, but when I have to pay 8 or 10 to cast him, it stops being worth it, because I can just use that mana to cast the giant spells that I need his counters for. He's randomly a 4/1, and he can use his counters to prevent damage, so I guess he's pretty good in combat, but realistically you're never going to need to use him in combat. He's just here to generate mana. So yeah, he's a pretty awesome general. I think most people prefer Rasputin as their Blink general. Unless you're going 3 colors, then you've got other options. So most cards in this deck fall into one of 3 categories. We've got the Blink effects, we have cards that like to be blinked, and then we've got random good stuff. And these first 2 piles are not as cut and dry as you'd think, because there's a whole bunch of restrictions based on which cards you run. So some of my Blink effects will only work on creatures. Some of them will return the card to play immediately. Some of them will only work at sorcery speed. Some of them will return the card to my hand. Some of them will be able to target my opponent's creatures. And this one will only target wizards. And the targets also have similar restrictions. Draining Welk, for instance, will only work if I can return it to play immediately. So I won't be able to use this with Mistmeadow Witch, for example, because I need Draining Welk back in play right away. Some of them will only work if I can target my opponent's creatures. Some of them will only work if I can target them at instant speed with a Blink effect, so I can't use Mangara with Venser. And then some of them will only work on non-creatures, like Spine of Ishsaw is an artifact. So just goes to show you that there's a whole bunch of interactions in this deck, but not all of them work together. So when you're putting an effect in this deck, try to remember which cards will this work well with, which cards will this not work with, and that's sort of important. So I have a lot of creatures in this deck, as you would expect, and the mana curve is actually pretty high. It's not that big a deal if I have Rasputin out, and he's giving me access to a bunch of colorless mana, but the deck can definitely be pretty slow. So most of the creatures in this deck either have a blink effect, which lets me reuse my other creatures, or they'll have a good come into play effect, which is really worth reusing. And if the creature is really good, it'll fall into both of those categories. So this first group of creatures is creatures that have blink effects built in. Mistmeadow Witch is sort of the poster child for the blink deck. For 2 mana, I get a 1/1 with a recurable blink ability. And this one is really useful because I can use it as many times as I want, and I can target my opponent's creatures. So if my opponent has a creature which is threatening to attack me, I can keep it out of combat. So this is one of the best effects for this deck. Galepowder Mage is cool. It's also got a reusable blink ability. I can't use it the turn it comes out, and I can only use it by bringing this thing into combat. It's not that big a deal because it has flying, and most likely one of my opponents will not have a flying blocker. So I will be able to use this thing quite reliably. I don't usually like one-shot blink effects in this deck because I like being able to reuse those effects. But if I'm going to run a one-shot effect, then I want it to be on a creature. So Flickerwisp and Glimmerpoint Stag, they both have the same ability. When they come into play, they can flicker any permanent on the board, including my opponent's stuff. So the reason I like using these is because I can use them to sort of filter my flicker effects. So like I said before, some of my effects don't work on some of my targets, so these things can help alleviate the lack of synergy there. So for instance, I can't use Venser's ability to flicker my opponent's Gilded Drake, but I can use Venser to flicker Flickerwisp and use that on Gilded Drake. And I can't use Momentary Blink on my Spine of Ishsaw, but I can use a Momentary Blink on my Glimmerpoint Stag, and then use that to recur the Spine. So I really like Flickerwisp and Glimmerpoint Stag. They just give me more options, and a one-shot effect isn't that bad, since most of my abilities that I'm recurring are pretty significant. So another way you can abuse come into play abilities is by running clone effects. So here we have 2 creatures who can copy other creatures. Body Double is going to come into play and become a copy of a creature in a graveyard. And this is kind of cool because it's going to give blue access to some much needed graveyard recursion, because blue doesn't really recur creatures in graveyards that well. Body Double is also a good part of a combo, which I'm going to get to later. Sakashima the Impostor, this one works really well in this deck because, as I said, clone effects are really good. And also it's got a built-in bounce effect, so I can use this to copy a Muldrifter or something and draw 2 cards, and then I've got this bounce effect built in, so I can recur it as many times as I like. Both of these don't really have the clone advantage of being able to destroy enemy generals, but I've got one more clone effect, which I'll get to later, called Rite of Replication. So next we have some creatures that abuse other creatures' come into play abilities, and which also have good come into play abilities themselves. So Venser Shaper Savant, this is a very versatile card in this deck. I can use this to deal with any spell on the stack or any permanent on the field, at least temporarily. And of course I can use it on my own creatures to reuse come into play abilities. These next 3 here, Karmic Guide, Revelark, and Sun Titan, they're all going to give me access to my graveyard. That's really important for this deck because I'm not built around a graveyard recursion strategy. I want my creatures to stay into play or stay in my hand, and these things are going to help me bring back creatures which have died. Karmic Guide is useful if I can blink it on my upkeep so I can avoid paying the echo cost, and the ability is going to target any creature in my graveyard, which is useful. Revelark and Sun Titan, however, have restrictions on what they can target. A lot of the creatures in this deck fall under those restrictions, however. They're mostly small utility creatures with good come into play abilities. And Revelark is actually a pretty potent combo piece in this deck. It's going to be a main win condition, which I'll talk about later. Sun Titan is also extremely useful because another main win condition in this deck is a 3-mana non-creature artifact. So it's nice to have a way to bring that back. So this deck also really likes bounce effects, since I can use those to reuse my creatures' come to play abilities, and I can also use them to keep my opponent's creatures off the board. So Tidespout Tyrant is going to be a very versatile card in this deck. It's definitely an annoyance if it stays on the board for too long. And then this one, Kederekt Leviathan. I really think this is an underrated card in blue, because it's basically a board reset, and blue doesn't have a whole lot of those. And it's especially annoying in any deck that can reuse this ability, like this deck. So if I can get this together with something stupid like Flickerwisp, then I basically got the rest of the board in a soft lock, where I'm not letting them keep any permanents on the board. And then if they eventually kill the Leviathan and get it off the board, he's going to get one more kick at the can with his Unearth ability. So this guy is really good in this deck, and yeah, he's definitely annoying for my opponents. Both these guys cost 8 mana, so they're going to benefit from Rasputin's mana for sure. So now I'm going to talk about all the creatures with good come to play abilities in this deck. These first two here, Trinket Mage and Solemn Simulacrum, these two are going to help me with my early game development, and they're going to help me accelerate into Rasputin. Pretty important because this deck is pretty slow out of the gates. And then Muldrifter, a pretty straightforward staple in this deck. I can flicker this to draw 2 extra cards every turn. Next we have Vendilion Clique. Seems like a pretty underwhelming come into play ability, but usually there's at least one other player at the table who you'd feel a lot more comfortable if you knew what was in their hand. And this deck is not running a ton of counter magic, so this is one way I can preemptively stop combos, or at least anticipate what's coming. So this thing is pretty good if I can recur it and pretty much take one player's good cards right out of the game. Draining Whelk, pretty straightforward. It's a huge creature some of the time. This could be a win condition, but mostly I'm just going to recur this as a reusable counter spell. And then Mnemonic Wall, such a great card for this deck. It's going to recur my counter spells and my utility removal, which is great. It's also going to have some really interesting interactions with other cards in this deck. So for instance, Ghostway, if I use this with a Mnemonic Wall out, then I'm going to get the Ghostway back over and over again, and basically get free blink effects for all my other creatures. And then, for example, if I have Tidespout Tyrant out, then I can use Momentary Blink on Mnemonic Wall, and basically keep getting it back, and basically have Capsize for 2 mana over and over again. I'm also running Time Stretch, so Mnemonic Wall is a very usable win condition. Next is Duplicant. I think I now own like 8 copies of this card because it just goes into every deck that we build. It's really, really good. No surprise, it's especially good in a deck which abuses come into play abilities, and a deck which has a general who generates tons of colorless mana. So yeah, Duplicant, really, really good. Sower of Temptation also has an awesome come to play ability, but I'm not really going to want to flicker this, since I lose the creature as soon as the Sower leaves play. However, I can use it to make sure that I always control the most dangerous creature on the board, so that's pretty useful. And then Gilded Drake. This is probably my favorite blink target in the deck. Unlike Sower of Temptation, the creature is mine permanently once I gain control of it. So if I can find a way to blink the Gilded Drake or bounce it back to my hand, then I'm going to just gain control of every creature on the board. So this thing is really, really awesome in this deck. Definitely my favorite card. These two creatures here don't really have come into play abilities, but they do like to be blinked. Glen Elendra Archmage is always awesome in a blue deck. 2 negates for 4 mana. But if I can use a bounce effect or a blink effect, then I can get rid of that -1/-1 counter and make sure that I can use this more than 2 times. And then Mangara of Corondor. This one is really interesting. The way his ability works, if I can put his ability on the stack and then bounce him to my hand or blink him before the ability resolves, then I'll be able to get rid of the permanent and he'll come back into play unharmed. So he is really, really useful if I can get him going with some sort of combo. And he's not bad on his own either. 1 for 1, remove any permanent from the game. And I think up until this point I've done a pretty good job of not running Sundering Titan, because he's kind of really mean, but he's just so perfect for this deck. He's got 8 mana casting cost and it's all colorless mana, so Rasputin's going to bring him out really easy. And he's got an ability which triggers every time he leaves or comes into play. So really, if I can just blink this guy once, then he's going to completely wreck the board. I'll feel bad about doing it, but I'm still going to win, so whatever. Next we have some utility creatures which don't really fit into the Blink theme of the deck, but Azorius Guildmage is just really awesome because it has two very useful abilities. The first one is going to stop aggressive decks from beating me down too quickly, and the second one is going to give me access to countering activated abilities, which nothing else in this deck can do, so that's just a useful ability to have. Teferi is awesome in any blue deck which relies on a creature strategy like this one, because it means I can flash in my creatures at end of turn rather than having to tap out during my main phase. He's especially good because a lot of my tricks and stuff will work better if I can do them at instant speed, and he's also going to stop my opponent blue players from countering my stuff, which is really good. And then Consecrated Sphinx, the most recently printed busted blue mythic. Pretty straightforward. I'm just going to play this because it's awesome, and then I'm going to clone it and draw my whole deck and stuff, and yeah, he's really good. So rounding out the creatures, we have Kozilek and Ulamog. Like I said before, one of the ways this deck can beat you is just by generating huge amounts of mana really quickly. And these guys are going to come out as early as turn 5 with Rasputin. I can use my blink effects, my bounce effects to reuse the cast abilities. But most of the time I'm just going to want to keep these guys out to abuse the Annihilator. And if I can get one of these guys out early, then that's a pretty quick way to win the game. So moving on to my non-creature spells, I'm going to start with the blink effects. Momentary Blink is awesome in this deck because it's a pretty efficient spell for 2 mana with a 4 mana flashback. The cool thing about this card is that it actually returns the creature to play immediately rather than at end of turn, which most of my other blink effects do. So this is going to work well with Draining Welk and with Venser, Shaper, Savant because I can use those to counter spells, and I need the creature to return to play immediately to get that effect. Ghostway is pretty good. The idea with this one is that I have a ton of creatures in play when I use it, and I can hopefully generate a huge advantage by reusing a bunch of abilities at once. Flicker Form. This is an aura, which is going to let me flicker the same creature over and over again. There's a ton of different uses for this card. Depends on whatever I have in play when I draw it. If I can stick this on Rasputin, then I can save him from getting nuked, and I can just make sure I've always got a ton of mana available all the time. Vanish into Memory. This one's kind of random. It looks like it was basically made for my general. I can flicker a creature and then draw cards equal to his power, and then discard cards equal to his toughness. So the fact that Rasputin is a 4/1 actually becomes significant here because it means I get to draw 4 and discard 1, which is pretty awesome for 4 mana, and it works as a blink effect, so it works really well in this deck. And then Venser the Sojourner. This guy is pretty awesome because he's got a reusable blink effect, and yeah, he can target any permanents, not just creatures, but only ones that I own. The second ability is going to be useful once in a blue moon. The last ability is a pretty awesome ultimate. The emblem is going to let me exile permanents every time I cast a spell, which is going to, I'm probably going to win if I pull that off. So, yeah, I kind of wish it weren't there because whenever I play Venser, it sort of makes me public enemy number 1, when really all I really want to do with him is abuse the first ability. But if I can build up to the emblem and I can pull that off, then it's pretty much game over. There's not much people can do when I'm exiling a ton of permanents every turn. So next I'm going to look at my reusable bounce effects. Capsize here is definitely awesome in any blue EDH deck because for 6 mana I can pay the buyback and basically keep the most dangerous threats off the board indefinitely. It's especially good in this deck because I like to bounce my own creatures and reuse those abilities. Crystal Shard is just a huge annoyance because my opponents just need to make sure they always keep open 1 or 2 mana to pay for the bounce effect. Otherwise they're just going to lose their creature. So it's going to set them back a turn, which is a huge pain in the ass. But it's especially good using it on my own creatures because nobody else has the option to pay 1. And it's just a really cheap and easy reusable bounce effect. And then Equilibrium, which is better still because I can target my opponent's creatures and it doesn't give them an option to pay 1. They're just going to lose creatures every time I cast my own. So this is a huge annoyance in this deck. It's actually a pretty big threat. It's going to draw a lot of hate once it's on the table because they know I'm going to be keeping their creatures off the table and reusing my own utility creatures. So it's definitely awesome. So next I'm going to talk about the combo pieces in this deck. Comboing off is actually my preferred win condition in this deck, mostly because it's kind of a pain in the ass to win through the attack phase. Even if I have an impenetrable board position, it's going to take me a few turns to win that way. So usually once I've got myself set up, I'm just going to tutor up some of these artifacts and end the game this way. Nim Deathmantle is pretty good because it's good even outside of the combo. Like I said before, people are going to be gunning for Rasputin as soon as he comes out, and if I cast him on turn 6, I'm not going to have any blue mana open to protect him with counter magic. So Nim Deathmantle is a good way that I can protect Rasputin using only the colorless mana that he brings with him. And people are going to be hesitant to attack into my chump blockers or to wrath the board because a lot of my creatures have those awesome come into play abilities, and Nim Deathmantle is going to bring them back. And then Blasting Station serves no other purpose than to combo. It's the main card for all 3 ways that this deck can combo off. Basically, it's going to work with any graveyard recursion engine. So Nim Deathmantle plus Rasputin is a graveyard recursion engine, and that'll win with Blasting Station. Or it can combine Revelark with either Karmic Guide or Body Double. So if I can assemble any of those 3 card combos, then Blasting Station is going to be the main win condition. So I'm not going to cast this until I absolutely have to, because I think most people realize that this is the card that's going to end the game every time. It's also useful just to have a sack outlet if I really need to recur something with Karmic Guide or Sun Titan, and I guess I can use it to ping a really annoying creature if I have to, but yeah, mostly it's in here just for the combo. Next we have some big mana spells, and these are not going to be hard to cast thanks to Rasputin's mana. Rite of Replication is awesome in this deck. Like I said, clone effects work really well in any deck that has come into play abilities. So for 4 mana, I get quite a bit of utility. I can also use this to destroy an opponent's general. But if I can get up to 9 mana, then this is definitely a serious win condition. If anyone's got like a Woodfall Primus out or a Bogart and Hellkite or something, then I can really do a lot with this thing. I can also just use it on like a Muldrifter or, I don't know, Sundering Titan, and just generate a huge amount of card advantage that way. Time Stretch, most of the time taking 2 extra turns will be enough to win the game, just because you can establish such a huge board presence with 3 turns in a row. But if that's not good enough, I can combo off with Mnemonic Wall. Basically any blink effect or return creatures to my hand effect, and I can take infinite turns in a row. So that's another win condition this deck can pull off. Pretty straightforward one, and it's a pretty lame one, but it's, it'll do the trick. Next, I'm going to take a look at some of the targeted removal in this deck. Spine of Ishsaw definitely fits the deck's theme because it has an awesome come into play ability, and I can recur this. I was a bit skeptical at first because I didn't think it would be that good unless I actually drew into a way to combo with it. But unlike creatures, artifacts never really get exiled that much, so once you cast Spine of Ishsaw, it's probably never going to go away, unless someone has the Return to Dust or something. I guess the cool thing about this is that once you cast it, it's just going to stay around all game. Eventually someone's going to Oblivion Stone and blow up the board, or eventually you're going to draw into some way to abuse this, like Venser. So it's definitely an awesome card in this deck. I especially like how it costs exactly 7 colorless mana, so I can drop Rasputin and then immediately throw this onto the table. Dismantling Blow, a pretty neat utility card in blue-white, a 3 for 1 for 6 mana. And then Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares will make any white deck, so those are always useful. I've only got a couple sweepers in this deck because I'm mostly relying on single target removal and utility which I get through my creatures. So I've got some good ones here though. Austere Command, I've talked about this one before. Selectivity is really awesome in EDH because you can blow up your opponent's stuff and keep most of your own stuff. So I like this in any white deck. And then Route, I think this is a good choice for white-blue decks since you really like to do stuff at instant speed. You'd rather leave mana open for other tricks. So I really like this one in this deck. I only have a small amount of counter spells in this deck, mostly because this is not explicitly a control deck, and because I'm sort of relying on my creatures for a lot of their counter magic. Some of the staples here, Counterspell, Cryptic Command, always a versatile choice, and Hinder, which is awesome at getting rid of generals. And then I really like Pact of Negation because I always like to tap out for Rasputin on turn 6, and this is another way that I can protect him for no mana. Rasputin's colorless mana is going to help me pay the hefty cost on the next turn, so that's pretty good. Then Muddle the Mixture. I don't usually like counter spells that don't always work, and this one is basically just a negate. But the Transmute is awesome in this deck because I can get Nim Deathmantle and I can get Mistmeadow Witch, which are my two favorite targets. So I really like this one in this deck. It's a decent counterspell tied to a tutor, so that's definitely versatile. Next we have our tutors. Mystical Tutor is pretty good. This is going to go for a Time Stretch or Austere Command or Rite of Replication or just some utility removal like Path to Exile. And then Fabricate and Enlightened Tutor. These two are pretty awesome in this deck because the main win conditions are combo pieces which are artifacts. So these are going to go for Nim Deathmantle, Blasting Station, and stuff like Duplicant and Sundering Titan are pretty good options as well. And a couple more utility cards. Sensei's Divining Top is going to go into every deck I make. It's just really useful having access to the top 3 cards of your deck at all time. And then Future Sight is just a huge amount of card advantage for blue decks. Yeah, the longer this stays out, the more advantage I get off of it. And of course, these two do a really good job of comboing with each other. So if I can combine that with Tidespout Tyrant, then that's a pretty good way to end the game right there. So unfortunately at this point in time I have more decks than Soul Rings, so we're using some budget mana rocks here. Everflowing Chalice isn't so bad. This is going to be my target for Trinket Mage. It's basically a Soul Ring for 4 mana. Dark Steel Ingot and Coalition Relic. I really like this one with Rasputin because it guarantees that I get him out on turn 4, which is pretty nasty. This is the card that's going to enable my 14 mana on turn 5. So I haven't put too much thought into the utility lands just yet, but we've got the Cycle Lance from Onslaught, Flagstones of Trocaire, and Cephalid Colosseum. Temple of the False God and Ancient Tomb. These are definitely good in this deck because we've got the big mana sub-theme, and Rasputin is going to come out a turn quicker with these. Strip Mine and Tectonic Edge to take out utility lands. Halmar Depths is pretty cool because it's got a come into play ability, so I can use Flicker effects on this to reuse it. Mistfell Plains is good because this deck does not have a ton of graveyard recursion, so it's nice to at least be able to put those cards into my deck. Academy Ruins is actually really important in this deck because the main win condition is an artifact, and people are going to blow up Blasting Station whenever they see it hit the table. So this is a good way to at least safeguard that win condition to bring it back. This card and Sun Titan are the only ways I can bring that card back, so it's really important in this deck. And then the big one, Riptide Laboratory is pretty awesome in this deck because it gives me a way to recur my wizards on a mana source. So just to give you an idea, this is going to help protect some of my more annoying wizards like Teferi or Mistmeadow Witch, and it's going to let me reuse stuff like Elendra, Archmage, Venser, Mangara, Vendilion Clique, and Trinket Mage. So Riptide Lab is definitely one of the best utility lands you can run in this deck. And then the rest of the mana base is just whatever dual lands I could get my hands on, plus a bunch of basics. So basically how the deck is going to play out, your first couple turns you're going to hope that you hit some of your fast mana, and if you do, you can get Rasputin out as quickly as possible. If you pull that off, you can win the game pretty quickly just by having a huge mana advantage. So you can grab an Ulamog or Kozilek and get it out really quickly. Most of the time, however, you're going to want to find your utility creatures and then set up some sort of engine with your blink effects. A lot of these effects are reusable, so if you can combine them with any of your utility creatures, then you're going to set up some sort of card advantage engine and hopefully use those to deal with your opponent's threats. Sometimes you can just completely lock your opponents out of the game. Something like Tidespout Tyrant or Equilibrium will keep their threats off the board, or if you can recur Sundering Titan or Kederekt Leviathan, then you're just going to completely deny them from having their resources. We're playing white and blue, which means that we have access to awesome control, good single target removal and counter spells, so it's nice to use those to back up our blink strategy. And then most of the time you're going to end the game with a combo. So you can set up Mnemonic Wall, Time Stretch, Future Sight, Sensei's Divining Top, Nim Deathmantle, and Rasputin Dreamweaver, or Revelar, Karmic Guide, Body Double, and then combine those with Blasting Station, which is the main win condition. Hopefully you can back that up with some tutors and Academy Ruins. So I guess the cool thing about this deck is that it's going to play out differently every time. We're not running many tutors at all, so we're just going to rely on redundancy and resiliency. Every game you're going to be setting up some sort of new synergy with your creatures and your blink engines. Most of the time you're going to go for the blasting station to end the game, but you're not always relying on the exact same cards to sort of get to that point in the game. You're going to win a long game. The attrition battles are really good for this deck. It's a bit of a slow deck, so if you want to add more fast mana, like if I can get a Soul Ring for this deck, I think it'll be a lot better. But yeah, like I said, it's a really fun deck, really challenging to play. You've always got so many options open, so you have to think pretty hard when you're playing this deck. So I hope you got some ideas. Maybe you can set up your own Blink deck. Leave some suggestions if you want, because this is a pretty new deck. I just built this recently, so I'm still developing it.